For this session, we have with us Professor C. Veeramani, Professor and Director, Center for Development Studies, Mr. Damu Ravi, Secretary, Economic Relations, MEA, Mr. Sunil Bhartwal, Secretary, Department of Commerce, MOCI, and Dr. Arvind Panagaria, Chairman, 16th Finance Commission of India, Professor of Economics, and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy, Columbia University. So can I have a welcome for all the panelists that I just named? Thank you. Moderating this session is Dr. Naushad Forbes, immediate past President CII, co-chairperson Forbes Marshall, and may I request you, sir, to kindly say your opening remarks and take the session forward.
Thank you very much. I'm definitely not immediate past president, ancient past president, more likely. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session on a topic which I think is of crucial importance to the future of our country and what it will take to thrive as an economy going forward. We're really fortunate to have a wonderful panel today. Dr. Arvind Panagaria is, as you know, the chair of the current Finance Commission. But in an earlier life, he was probably our leading trade economist as an academic. And for many, many years, and has written many books, including, as we were just saying earlier on, a wonderful book called Trade and Development, which came out a few years, which makes a very powerful argument in favor of trade as a driver of economic growth and development. Commerce Secretary Sunil Bhartwal, it's a pleasure to have you with us. He's very much at the helm of all our discussions and negotiations on various free trade agreements at present. As you'll hear, very much in the thick of economic policy making in the country. My friend Damu Ravi, who's Secretary Economic Relations in the Ministry of External Affairs. Damu is one of our leading trade negotiators, has played an active part in many negotiations over the years. And I should say that much of what I know about trade policy and trade in economics, I've learned from Arvind and from Damu. And Professor Veeramani is the director of the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. And his work focuses on the connections between industrial policy and trade policy. So, wonderful panel. They decided quite unfairly just before we started that I needed to work a little harder as the moderator. So we would go straight into Q&A instead of each making some prepared statements. And there are some statements that have been prepared. So we thought we'd try a new model. So I'm going to start with Arvind. Arvind has made a very powerful and persuasive case for the role that trade can play in economic growth and development. He's made this case for all countries, but he's made this case particularly powerfully for India. And if you look at our own experience in history bears this out. The time that we grew the fastest in the 2000s was the time that our trade to GDP ratio was rising as a country. It peaked in 2012, I think at 56%, imports plus exports as a percentage of GDP. And since then, it's come down a bit. It came down to 40%, and in recent years has gone back up, I think, to around 46% now. And when you look at the total slowdown in growth, there was a paper some years ago that Sajid Chinoy did, where he explained almost the entire slowdown in growth by the reduction in the trade to GDP ratio that took place between the 2000s and the 2010s. So we also know that we live in an increasingly unfriendly world when it comes to trade. You can't pick up a financial newspaper or The Economist or whatever without seeing an article that will talk about new protectionist impulses anywhere in the world, particularly, of course, with the soon-to-be installed 47th President of the United States. Right? But in that environment where the world would seem to be closing off, there are still huge opportunities for us in India. And I wanted Arvind to start by addressing that point, because there's no one better than him to make that case, the case for trade in India and the case for trade in India at this point in time in our history.
Thank you, Naushad, and I'll take the blame for the change of the format. You are such a good moderator that it would have been a waste of your talent if you were here present and we did not have you moderate the session in the way you are going to moderate. And I'm sure at the end of this session, everybody in the audience will agree with me. All right. So first of all, the very basic statement, why those of us who advocate free trade do so. So the very basic point is a simple one, which is that when you open to trade, you begin to specialize in the products in which your production costs are the lowest and export those products. And you get out of the activities in which your production costs are much higher or higher than your competitors outside in the outside world, and you import those. So there is a double whammy of gain that you're producing those products for which you can get higher returns abroad, and you are getting out of the activities in which your own cost of production are much higher. This is the basic statement of the well-known principle of comparative advantage. Second, also when there are economies of scale, which in modern times actually have come to characterize almost every single industry, if I may boldly assert so. You look at the firm sizes in China, for instance, and the cost of production at which Chinese are able to export their products. It'll tell you that the scale is one of the key factors behind the success of China. And effectively, if you even for a country like India, the domestic market is actually not large enough to exploit those economies of scale. And what trade lets you do is you become the global supplier for whatever it is that you produce. And so you are able to take advantage of scale economies. That's the basic point. Now, there are a lot of objections that get raised in today's world. That, well, it was okay when, South Korea was doing it, it was okay when Taiwan was doing it, it was okay when even China was doing it. Although China surprised everybody because, a lot of the times we used to argue that, for a large country, this is not going to, for a small country it would work, but when it worked for China, then that argument certainly basically collapsed. But today it is argued a couple of points that the world is turning protectionist and that automation is happening and automation will lead to reshoring of manufacturers, and therefore you are not going to be able to have those export opportunities that China, Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, etc. had. I think those are both incorrect arguments for the following set of reasons. First, take the protectionism around the world. It is true that protectionism has been on the rise, but even then, taking that as given, world markets today are probably more open than almost at any point in time. Today, the global market in merchandise exports is 25 trillion. This is the new peak after COVID. The pre-COVID peak was 19 trillion. Post-COVID, it became 25 trillion. That's the merchandise exports. Come to services, pre-COVID peak was 6 trillion, post-COVID is 7 trillion. So it is a very large market in spite of all the challenges that have come from, protectionist moves in the United States, all sorts of embargoes on Russia, the trade conflict between US and China that happened under the first Trump presidency, which was then continued under President Biden. In spite of all that, trade has continued to grow, and it is a very large market. Our share in this very large market is less than 2% for merchandise exports and less than 4% for services. So we are still really a very tiny part of it. So whether that trade in the future grows or not, given how large that market is and how small our share is, we have, just to give you an idea, China's share is about 12 to 13%. There's plenty for us to exploit in the global marketplace. So the global marketplace, in spite of the rising protectionism, industrial policy in the United States and Europe and whatnot, at the end of the day, is not going to be a constraint. It's not. So, most certainly. Come to automation. Once again, it is true that capital has been replacing labor in the manufacturing activities generally. I'm focusing a little bit more on manufacturing. We can also talk about services, but for now, let me stay with manufacturing. So it is true that, labor required per unit of output has been declining. But that has not eliminated the importance of employment opportunities in manufacturing or the relevance of trade, for the simple reason that, while labor costs are declining, overall costs are declining, markets are becoming larger and larger. So the value of export market has grown. As I mentioned, the large size 25 trillion today. So it is true that automation reduces the amount of labor per unit of production, but you produce more. When productivity rises, prices fall, market enlarges. And that is going to continue to happen. That's one part of it. But it is also the case that many activities have not been automated yet, and it's going to still be some time before they get automated. Clearly, stitching clothes is still an activity done by hands. Labor is required. Some years ago, Adidas tried to automate the manufacturing of footwear. They opened one factory in Germany, one in Atlanta, United States, where they automated everything except putting the shoelaces into the shoes, but then found that that led to such a cost disadvantage that those factories couldn't succeed. They have to close down both those factories, and production has now moved to China. So this reshoring that we talk about is also is still, quite far away. It's not happening. And not only, first of all, some of the activities have not been and are unlikely to be replaced by machines in the near future, but even if that happens, even if technological feasibility happens, commercial viability is a different matter. So even, if cost-wise, if doing things with hands is still less costly than it is to automate, let the robots do the tasks and so forth, then those labor-intensive activities will still remain viable commercially in spite of technological feasibility of them being performed by machines. So that is, I think, overall. One last point I should make is that in today's world, actually, the relevance of freer trade is even more than it was in the past. For the reason being this: one, that global market is very large, but in addition, with the innovation, it has become feasible to subdivide the production activity into more and more sub-activities. And therefore, you can locate these activities in many different parts of the world, wherever it is the least costly to produce, right? And my favorite example is iPhone, which is manufactured by, using parts that are produced in 43 different countries and eventually assembled. Now, in this kind of situation, when parts are moving ultimately for final assembly across many different borders, if there are high tariffs at each border cost is added on. And tariff on tariff is also then added on, because if multiple crossings are happening, already the price at which the crossing is happening is higher because of the tariff paid on the previous stage, and so you are multiplying. So even low tariffs can translate into very high tariffs, and therefore the cost becomes very high. You don't want that cost to be adding up. So that is another very important factor to take into account. And this finally ties up into the China plus one issue, that if you really want the multinationals to come on to Indian shores, you want to give them play over a very large space over which frictionlessly products, inputs, outputs, and products and processing, everything can move. So have free trade agreements with the European Union, have free trade agreement with United Kingdom. We have already done with Australia, some other countries. That would give a large space where the inputs and outputs and processing, etc., can move freely without any friction. And that, I think, is something in today's world where small cost differences lead to the product being located in another location, the freer trade and lower tariffs become even more important. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Arvind. And I think we'll come back to two of the points that you raised, I'm sure. One on free trade agreements and the role of free trade agreements in our future. And second, the role of global value chains. And what does it mean to really most powerfully and productively tap into global value chains as we move along. Let me go next to our Commerce Secretary. And Commerce Secretary, as you look at our trade policy over the next few years, say the next 3, 4, 5 years, how do you think things will be different? What would good look like to you for our trade policy 3 years or 5 years out? Would we have less in the way of tariff protection? Would we have more in the way of tariff protection? Would we be more selective? Would we be more broad-based? What would our export policy be? Would we be more, trying to promote exports in a particular way, as we've done at different times in the past? Would we be trying to incentivize exports in a particular way? Would we be trying to reskill and move to different sectors? Would love to hear your outlook for how you'd see good in our trade, in the trade arena in the next, say, 3 years.
Thank you, Naushad, and let me thank Dr. Panagaria, because he has laid the foundation of this discourse which we are doing here. And I think, Naushad, you have raised very, very important issues. Now, I also feel that trade is only an extension of your production prowess within the country, whether it is manufacturing prowess or whether it is your prowess to produce those services at the competitive rates. Now, and therefore, I think today's topic, when I received the topic and it said that how the industrial policy, the trade policy, and the investment policy, what should be the combined role of these policies and what way we should envisage these policies so that ultimately the economy grows and India, as we are visioning for our 2047, that it becomes the third largest economy of the world. So, first of all, for any trade to happen, we have to establish competitiveness both in manufacturing as well as in services. Fortunately, in services, we have done an excellent role. If you look at the services component, it is in the morning session, I told that about 45.8% of the trade share is with the services sector. Indian ITS sector has done extremely wonderful role in terms of not only ensuring that global production systems are competitive, but India has a major role to play in that. And I think for services competitiveness to rise, we need to move from ITITS, which is the core, because if you look at the digitally delivered services in the world, that is now huge, more than 4 trillion out of the 7 trillion, which Dr. Panagaria talked about. So I think the capacity to deliver these services, whether these are ITITS services, and India is emerging as a hub for digitally delivered services because we have created the public digital infrastructure, huge cost-effective public digital infrastructure, not costlier one. And therefore, this prowess is going to remain. What we need to do in services is, again, that the professional services, the other services, which are related to maritime services, financial services, I think we need to do some more work on that. And I feel that the way India is growing and way the service trade is growing, not only it will reach 50%, but it will be more than 50% of our total trade basket. And we are estimating that by 2030, it should reach $1 trillion of services trade. Now, along with the services trade, I think manufacturing is very, very important to us. Government has recognized that. PLI is the scheme which looks at that how you can improve your manufacturing prowess. And I'm very glad to say that when Government of India picked up these 14 PLI sectors where we looked at that whether it will be import substitution or export promotion, I'm very glad to say that, in just few years period, we have grown from $59 billion in terms of exports to about $87 billion. So that is the kind of impetus it has given to exports. So exports is an extension of what you do domestically, and that is very, very important to understand. And therefore, trade policy cannot be de-linked from your manufacturing policy, from your production policy, from your services policy. Now, how to grow further? Because, now if we look at Indian economy, it is very open. You gave out certain figures. I was also reading out certain figures in the morning. We are one of the largest open economies in the world, more open than US and China, if you look at the share of trade in the GDP. And as your GDP increases, perhaps there will be some changes in those shares. But frankly speaking, today, we are one of the most open economies of the world. Secondly, our intent is to open up further. And why that intent is there? That intent is there because we realize that today there is no Ricardian kind of trade which happens. In Ricardo's trade paradigm, trade was wholly obtained. If a product is wholly obtained in one country, it was being traded with another country where the other product was getting wholly obtained. Today, we have moved towards a production system which is interconnected, interlinked, integrated. It is happening in the value chains. If you look at the global trade, although it reflects in the trade statistics of the countries, but it is intra-firm trade. 70% of the global trade is intra-firm trade, which means, and I agree with Dr. Panagaria, that when you are looking at assembly production, you have to also look at from where the parts are coming. And therefore, the tariff policy has to be linked to that. So you cannot in today's world say that only I will produce final products, I will not produce intermediate products. You have to be in that value chain. Now, the most important thing which has recently happened in the global trade scenario is that we have taken commitments, all the countries have taken commitments for energy transition. And energy transition not only gives opportunities, but it is also a disruptor. It is a disruptor in the automobile sector, which we have seen. And unless and until the automobile sector gears itself for the EV production, obviously it is creating disruption in US, it is creating disruption in other countries. Now, that is also offering you an opportunity because I think the scales can rise. Similarly, energy transition is also giving an opportunity to move towards non-fossil fuel-based production, which involves solar cell, wind, green hydrogen, etc., etc. So, which means that energy transition is going to be the next driving force for the next industrial revolution or manufacturing revolution in the world. And where we place ourselves, that is very, very important. Now I come to what is our stand towards the FTAs. Our stand towards FTAs clearly emerges from this understanding that we have to integrate with the other countries, particularly the large countries like EU and ASEAN, and recently we have gone ahead with IPF kind of an agreement where we are looking at the value chains, how we can integrate with the value chains. And in fact, let me just tell you that just 20 days back, I was in Brussels and we were discussing with the EU. And I told them that, FTAs should not be looked at only from the legalistic point of view, only from the point of view of, regulatory practices, but it also needs to be looked at from the economic point of view of integration of value chains. How better two countries or two partners can integrate their value chains in a better manner. So that is the kind of understanding which is arising on part of our FTA strategy. And our FTA strategy is fully aligned with the Government of India policy, where we are saying that our industry should grow, our industry's competitiveness should grow, we should trade with the competitive advantage, but where the production system is linked. Part may be coming from one country and going to another country to finish. Assembly may be happening in one country, parts may be originating from other country. So we feel that FTAs are also the means for the economic integration among these countries, and we look forward to these FTAs. We are engaging with these FTAs. FTAs are legal documents in perpetuity, so therefore you have to do a very detailed exercise. Sometimes, we feel that why it is taking time, but these are the interests aligned with what is your long-term policy. We are looking at the long-term vision of 2047 when we will have 100 years of our independence. I was reading the Draghi report, which has become a vision document for the new EU Commission. And it is also talking about, what kind of shortages they have. You rightly mentioned that, we have that demographic dividend which is available with us. Our STEM professionals are being highly respected, and that is how the GCCs are coming into the country, and how the R&D is moving into the country, how the STEM professionals are being used in the global supply chain by various countries. So I feel that our trade policy is fully aligned with the goals of industrial development, industrial policy, and I think we need to look at our trade policy from that particular perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commerce Secretary. So we'll come back to the FTA point, I'm sure, in a bit. I wanted to come to Damu next, and Damu, I'll ask you about global value chains. Arvind referred to global value chains, that a very high share of world trade now happens within these global value chains. The Commerce Secretary spoke about the need for inputs into global value chains to come in an easy, free, and presumably free of tariff way. And we know that in economics, they say that a tax on imports is a tax on exports. And there have been these economic models that show this quite clearly, right? And we sometimes, I think, have this idea that exports are good, but imports are bad. Milton Friedman, many years ago, had this wonderful statement where he said, well, you can't eat exports. You can eat imports. So the country actually, in a sense, benefits from imports. The people benefit from the imports in a substantial way. So how would you see our participation in these global value chains? Because many of these global value chains, particularly in the new areas that we're getting into, like electronics, are centered in Asia. Yet all our free trade agreement work at present is not Asia focused. Our free trade agreements are oriented towards the UAE, to Australia, to the EU, of course, to Israel, earlier on to Canada. They're not looking at Asia. And can we participate in global value chains in an effective way without a much more engaged trade policy that takes Asia into account?
Thanks, Naushad, and good afternoon to all of you. At the outset, I'd like to thank Professor Arvind Panagaria for laying the context for this discussion today. I think on the GVC, the global value chains, let's put it in a different way, the global supply chains, as we are also familiar with, it is used in either ways. But I must say our own understanding in the government and also in the industry circles is very recent. I think there's been only a recent appreciation that something like the GVC or the global supply chains exist because for a long time we've been in a denial mode. We always felt that there was some kind of a conspiracy that the markets in India are going to be robbed by the Western countries or the multinationals through the GVC. But that's the reality. We were never comfortable with this idea of supply chains. Now, it's a complex process, and supply chains operate, in my view, broadly three dimensions ways. One is the domestic supply chains, regional supply chains, and the global supply chains. Now, the complex process is not that, when you say domestic supply chains, is only within the domestic, but sometimes the components are also needed from a very close areas where it is available, and wherever it is available at a good price and at a good quality. So what happens is sometimes it's a complex in another sense. It's moving across the borders and coming back into your own country. We have to recognize this complexity. But what happens every time there is a movement, there is a value addition, which is why many often we say it's a global value chains. But there are complementarities. And underpinning this is the competitiveness. A manufacturing unit or an industry will buy essentially from where they can source from at a good price and at a competitive price. And in the process, it is able to make what he is manufacturing also competitive, to be able to sell both in the domestic market and international markets. In the recent times, we've seen there has been a big disruption to the supply chains. One is the COVID pandemic, second was the geopolitical tensions, the Red Sea attacks, the logistic costs have gone up. So there has been no understanding as to how important it is for countries to ensure that the supply chains are diversified. Because the concentration of supply chains, and this is where it is, China is the factory of the world, and China holding that much of concentration of supply chains can also weaponize trade. And that's a big risk. Many countries have realized it, and the need for diversifying supply chains. Now, this has to be done very consciously. We're talking about today the resilient supply chains in that context. So each sector is able to develop its own supply chains from countries which you think are more friendly towards you. And in the near term and the medium term, this may work. But ultimately, even the resilient supply chains have to evolve into a more competitive processes and help the manufacturing to be competitive. Then only it will become relevant and useful. The entire global supply chains or the value chains would also mean that you would need openness, open policies that is able to embrace globalization. That's an important condition for the supply chains to be effective. For a country like India, which is going to be a 5 trillion, 10 trillion, and 30 trillion dollar economy, it's quite obvious that all that you produce is not going to be consumed within the country. It has to go out. some of what you manufacture will become going around. Commerce Secretary has already mentioned that you have a target of 1 trillion in the services by 2030, another 1 trillion in the manufactured sector, which means a 2 trillion manufacturing capacity that India would have and exporting out of in the country. What it means is that we need to drive, or we need to develop our own supply chains. And that's an important aspect of your export strategy. So if you have to develop your own supply chains, then you have to understand the ecosystem that needs to be developed within the country. One of which is actually you need to work on the scale. If you don't have the scale, then benefits of the economies of scale cannot be evenly spread and improve on the production and the product itself. The scale is important. So I see a lot of hope here. The industrial corridors that the country is building, the infrastructure, the pace at which it is happening, and the need for cluster-based manufacturing is all a part of the strategy. And I think the Prime Minister's vision captures all of this, but we need to get them implemented at a much faster pace. And the second thing is we also need to look at both imports and exports in equally important terms. Ideally, many countries only look at export as the strategy. Yes, you got to have an export orientation in your trade policy, but what drives exports, as Nauthar has shared, is imports as well. But what do you import is also an important input into the trade policy. So you would need to, ideally you will import what you need, that you don't produce, or you think it's not worth producing in the country. So it have to look at this understanding that both import and exports are important. It is not about zero tariff. You don't have to go to zero tariff to be able to drive your own supply chains. It's the consistency of the tariff policy is what is important. So if you're all the time tweaking your import tariff policy, then it's that much more difficult for a multinational or an international company to come and set up their shop here for manufacturing. So there has to be that consistency level. Several years, you got to have that consistency. The third important dimension of this entire GVC is how do you enable next level of manufacturing take place? We are talking about semiconductors, electronics, robotic engineering, and Commerce Secretary mentioned about the green transition energies, renewables. All of this require what is known as development of ecosystem. And I think we need to understand within our own industrial policy as we develop it, that for you to have a large picture, large project, product coming into the country, the ecosystem has to evolve. And we need to facilitate that ecosystem. And automatically, the ancillary units will develop alongside. So if you are looking at, let's say, automobile today, so much of localization has happened in the country for many of the automobile companies that are developing their own cars. Why? Because the ecosystem over a period of time has evolved to an extent that is able to bring a product on the roads which is driven by Indian-owned supply chains. I think in the new technologies also, we have to have a broad picture, but enable the units to come up that are able to produce the components that are needed for that big unit. But that requires time, because you've got to have a patience, you've got to have a plan, a long-term plan. If you're looking at a semiconductor, then naturally 10 years' time or a 15 years' time is what is required for you to have full localization. But for that to happen, you got to have openness, you got to have a more transparent and consistent import policy. The last item that I would like to emphasize here is ultimately we have to envisage a situation where India is able to develop manufacture of finished goods outside of India. That is what I say, Indian-owned SEZs. And that Indian-owned SEZs will be driven by your Atmanirbhar Bharat. Most of the components feed into that finished product outside of India. Ultimately, this is a market strategy. Every country that has emerged today to be a great economy have developed that strategies. You got to have your manufacturing bases outside of India that's able to develop a finished product so that the locals are able to own it as their own, but components feeding from India. That should be part of your long-term strategy on the GVCs. The last item, this is fundamentally, in my view, very strategic. We may say economic, but it's also very strategic for a rising country, a country that's going to be increasingly a global player. Then you have to look for integration of economies. And that's possible if you have a long-term plan And as I say, Naushad has mentioned about Asia. Yes, of course, Asia will form an important part of that strategy because Asia has a very strong, robust value chains evolved here. They have a lot of components that we would need. So this kind of integration, regions, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, these are all closer geographically. That should form part of a long-term strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Damu. We'll come back to many of these points, I think. So, Professor Veeramani, many have referred to the role of industrial competitiveness. And industrial competitiveness often takes the form of how firms compete within a given environment, but it also very often shows in industrial policy and in the way one designs future sources of competitiveness through various interventions that we attempt. How would you see industrial policy play with trade policy to deliver that goal that we have of industrial competitiveness so that we do not need tariffs to protect industry because industry is perfectly competitive on its own?
Yeah. So we see in recent times there is a re-emergence of industrial policy, and this has happened both in advanced countries and also in developing countries like India. India has become also a major user of industrial policy. Now, in economics, the rationale for industrial policy is well known. It is basically a strategic state action directed at changing the structure of the market. The underlying assumption is that market on its own is not able to allocate resources efficiently under certain circumstances, which we call market failure. So that is basically the rationale for industrial policy. But what is happening in practice, when you look at what are the determinants of industrial policy or the nature of industrial policy, we often see that in practice is not related to market failure. It is related to all other factors like political economy, protectionism, geopolitical competition, technological leadership, resilience. These are the type of factors with which industrial policies are closely related. So that means that it can lead to, if industrial policies are not properly implemented or designed, it can lead to huge cost, resource misallocation, cost, retaliation, protectionism, all these will happen. So now in that context, how do we rethink industrial policy, particularly in the context in which we are talking about the global value chains? So we know that there is a traditional industrial policy argument. At that time, the underlying logic is that production from start to end in most of the industries are conducted in one country. But now that is not the situation. Like as we already discussed here, production processes in several industries are globally fragmented. In that context, industrial policy need to be redesigned. It cannot be the same old type of industrial policy because the earlier industrial policy assumes an integrated domestic production structure, but now it is like individual countries have to choose where within the value chain of a given industry, where should they focus. Now, from a developing countries perspective, like India, our comparative advantage lies in labor-intensive stages within GVC, like, for example, assembling final product using abundant labor that is available in our country. And that is a way to create a large scale of employment for relatively low-skilled people, those who are engaged in agriculture, surplus labor in agriculture, or in the informal sector. So that is the way to get them into the formal sector. Like, for example, in mobile phone industry, a lot of people are now working, and many of them are women workers who were earlier engaged, either unemployed or engaged in informal sector. So this is their first entry into a formal sector employment. Now, what are the tools then it is required for industrial policy in this context? Earlier, in the conventional industrial policy like import substitution used tariffs, high tariffs and import controls, but that will not work in today's world when there are global value chain because easy access to low-cost imports are very important. So we need to fundamentally change the way we look at industrial policy. And the other way in which we have to look at this is that earlier in the industrial policy like import substitution period in India, the objective is to build domestic capacity first and then eventually export once you achieve competitiveness and then compete with the multinational companies. But that should not be the sequence now. It is just the reverse. exporting is not the end goal. It is the starting point. So like in mobile phone, in the case, we started by exporting. That is what we should do. And then develop the ecosystem to move up in the value chain over time. And in this process, multinational companies, or what we call lead firms, play the most important role, because they should be they should be playing the most important role, because 2/3 of global exports are controlled by multinational companies, and the GVCs operate within their control. So that is other thing that we need to look at. And within this, the future growth within this GVC world is in terms of you enter into assembly, because that is where your current comparative advantage is, and then we move into higher value-added stages within the GVC. Moving up in the value chain, we have what is called the smile curve. Like, so you enter at the lower part of the smile curve initially, and then as you develop your ecosystem, achieve the scale, you can move in the two sides of the smile curve. That means designing, marketing, all those things which are high value added. Initially, you will get a low domestic value added per unit of what you export, but that is fine, because there is a scale effect, because you are producing for the large global market. So you get a scale effect that overall domestic value addition would be much high, even though value added per unit is low initially. But also it has an advantage that you enter into this industry, and then you experience, you get an experience learning by doing, economies of scale, and then move up in the value chain with the time. And there industrial policy can play a very crucial role, because there could be market failure in moving up in the value chain, producing certain components, etc. Government might need have to get in terms of certain support. Lastly, I will give one example of how this will work in a real world scenario. Take the case of India's mobile phone sector. Earlier in 2016, government introduced the phased manufacturing program. The phased manufacturing program is something very much like the old industrial policy, because it is based on import substitution idea, high tariff barriers, and who are the players? Mostly small Indian companies and small Chinese companies. What was the outcome? Production increased little bit, but practically no export. And whereas in 2019, new policy on electronics and the PLI scheme came, where the objective was not domestic market, it was a global manufacturing, making India a global manufacturing hub, and export is a major, played a major role in their designing of that policy. And what was the instrument? It is the targeted subsidies under the PLI scheme, and these targeted subsidies may be required even for assembly, because even though we have a comparative advantage in doing assembly, the effective cost of doing assembly in India is very high because of factor market rigidities. So to address that, to offset some of those cost disadvantage, there is a rationale in giving that. And who are the players? It is not small Indian companies. It is big companies like Apple and Samsung. They played the major role in this process. And what is the result? Result is that India becomes the second largest producer of mobile phone in the world, and the production is now around $50 billion, and the exports is about $16 billion. It became a major share of Indian production is now export, and there is a significant decline in imports, and we became a major exporting country in this sector. Our trade, and we started recording trade surplus. So we have evidence, we have an example in our own country how this type of a policy would work, and if we can replicate this example, this success in the entire manufacturing, I think there is a huge gain that we can create in terms of employment generation in this country. That's what.
Thank you, Professor Veermani. Thank you. I'm going to ask one last question, which I'm going to open to anyone from the panelists who'd like to pick it up. But in the meanwhile, if you could think of your questions, and we'll take probably 3 questions, which we'll then answer together. So the question actually is on China. China is a country that China's the world's biggest manufacturer. It's the world's largest exporter. it's also the world's second largest importer. The US, as we know, is the world's largest importer. It's also the world's second largest exporter. Both countries import a lot. We export a reasonable amount to the US. We have a positive trade balance with the US. We have no FTA, but we have a huge negative trade balance with China. Last year, we imported, I think we have a negative trade balance of around $100 billion with China. It's a huge negative trade balance. And the CEA recently floated an idea, I think in the economic survey, that we should be looking at China as a source of investment and encourage actually Chinese firms to establish operations in India, in joint ventures, in subsidiaries as they choose, and as an alternative to simply importing from China, and to use it as a way forward. Partly learning, partly reducing our own trade deficit with China by getting Chinese firms to be more active in India. And it's a little of what you, Damu, spoke of in terms of what you'd like to see Indian firms do, of establishing end assembly plants in other countries. You see Chinese firms doing exactly that in India and in many other countries in the world now. So what's our view on China? You know, that do we see China as a market? I fear that too many of my friends in industry only see China as a source of imports. We do not see China as a market to export to. They're a large market. They're the second largest importer in the world. What should we be doing in that area, if anything? Or should we sort of say, hey, listen, China's not for us. Leave it out of the trade picture. Leave it out of the investment picture. Anyone like to pick that up? And then we'll take 3 questions from the floor. Sure, thank you.
So, you know, obviously geopolitics is everywhere in this question. The way I come out on this is that indeed one needs to be a little bit careful. China is unpredictable. And from whom you take investment, with whom you trade, has now, in the current environment, become a little more important than it used to be. Having said that, what I would do is look at, you know, where are the investments from an potentially unfriendly country where it could inflict damage on me. Probably a handful of those sectors I can identify. Leave those aside. In the rest, I would go and check, is China investing in other countries in these particular activities and sectors? If the answer is yes, if US is taking investments from China in these sectors, if Germany is taking, I would open to that investment as well. So I think this is a qualified yes answer that, you know, but the activities from which you would want to exclude are really relatively few. Because I don't see other countries restricting Chinese investments in large number of sectors. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, Arvind. Thank you. I think that was a very judicious answer. So thank you. Yes, we'll take, so one in front. And here's the request is it needs to be a question, please, not a comment. If you would like to make a comment, we'll have the discussion outside after the session. So a question, and we'll take 3. So we'll take one from the front here, and then I'll go back there, right? And then I'm trying to see if I can take one from the back somewhere. Back of the room, you know, I mean, it's backbenchers otherwise go to sleep. Yeah. So, yeah, okay, so one here, one here, and one there. Thank you.
Thank you, folks. You have given me an opportunity to wake up at least. My question is basically on the balance of payment. I'm on the manufacturing field for last 40 years, automotive component, chemicals, and coincidentally, financial services. The most difficult part is on the assemblies, the intermediary product, which is a necessary for the assemblies, final assemblies are produced in China itself. That itself is creating lot of problems and giving us lot of problems, hence the difficulty in payment. As an exporter, yes, we export
so
to...
your question, please.
My is how to get above this difficulty. Therefore, this is something which is very difficult to answer. They have indicated or got into fields which has been done after a lot of research only on the intermediately product, which is an obstacle for final manufacturing. How do we think to ease that?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. You take the three. Yeah.
There has been a reference of China plus one. Looking at the reality, I would just like to know your views. Are we able to be the one of China plus one in real terms? I'm actually trying to make a comparison with ASEAN and India in terms of getting inward investments for manufacturing, and within ASEAN, primarily Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia. Thank you.
Okay. And the last one there, yeah.
Thank you for an insightful session. I just want to ask one question is that does India is tapping very well in terms of the capabilities of the already capable people? Because few weeks back I visited one PCB assembly factory in Mysore, outskirts of Mysore, and it looks like a world-class factory, but they are crying that they don't have much of the international customers for the factories. So that is also one problem which we have seen.
So your question?
My question is, what are we doing in terms of tapping in the talent of the Indian industry to export?
So who would like to take any of those, any of the questions? Yeah. Sure.
I'll take the China plus one. Potentially, I think India has a huge advantage over the countries that you have named, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, for the simple reason that India is significantly larger, many times larger. What that means is that potentially the skill mix that is available on scale is here. Geography, land that is required for location of the supply, for the building up of supply chains within the country, meaning domestic supply chains, is enormous. Our disadvantage really is largely policy. I mean, imagine, particularly if you're thinking Vietnam, it's a small country in the end, once you get past the 80, 90 million people in the country, effectively, your wages begin to skyrocket. In India, for various levels of skills, you can continue to have supply available without a major escalation in wages, simply because there are so many. Our problem really here is the policy. We have made land incredibly expensive. We have made employment of labor incredibly difficult. These are the internal policy barriers, inflexibilities that we need to work on. A lot of progress has been made in the last 20, 25 years. Even for example, the GST reform, big change, a single tax across the entire nation, things like that. But we do need to work a bit more on labor and land markets. If multinationals are going to come out of China, my kind of view, perhaps a little jaundiced, is that there is nowhere else to go but India, for the simple reason of the size. I mean, China is so large, and if anybody is going to replace China for the next 15 or 20 years, it has to be India.
Thanks, Arvind. Sunil? Yeah.
So I think one cross-current, thought which was running in the three questions was regarding the, we have accepted the fact that today the global production is in the value chains. But I think post-COVID, everybody has realized that value chains are important, but resiliency of the value chains is more important than simply having a value chain. And I think perhaps post-COVID, the globe has also recognized one very important fact, that there cannot be dominance of a particular country, particularly a non-market economy, in terms of having all the supply chains, keys to those supply chains with them. So with that respect, perhaps India is in a sweet spot, and we have this opportunity, the whole globe, in fact, wherever we are going for FTA negotiations, everybody is telling us. In fact, yesterday, we had discussions with all the EU ambassadors in Delhi, and everybody was telling that they want to do an FTA with us, because people are realizing that even if there are global value chains have to be resilient. You cannot put all your eggs in one basket, and therefore India has a very, very important role to play in diversification of this value chain system. So I think we have a great potential there, and the way we are progressing in terms of our industrial policy as well as in trade policy, I'm very sure that India will play that role. Thank you.
So I think we need to, I was going to give Damu the last word, but I think we need to close and let the next session take over. But I'll just close by thanking all of you for your questions and thanking all of our wonderful panelists for their comments on difficult issues. But I think identifying the huge potential that exists for us as a country, if we look at the world in ambitious terms, if we look at the world as a market that we need to serve and the market that we have that's available for us to take advantage of through the right ambitions of firms and the right policies to support them. Thank you.
Again, post-lunch, that was a very feeble round of applause. Can we have a louder one, please? Thank you, thank you. Dr. Forbes okay, let the photo op happen. May I request Dr. Forbes to kindly hand over a token of appreciation to each of our panelists, please. Thank you very much.